Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Samantha, and I'm the Director of Member Partner Services for the Florida Association of ACOs. We are super excited for this opportunity to present to you our next installment of our webinar series. Today is going to be using the new CMS and OIG Stark and Anti-Kickback revisions with value-based enterprises. How to achieve greater savings for your ACO. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You can see the user control panel on your computer desktop on the bottom. You can listen in via your computer speakers, or if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone and the dial information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions tab. You may send in your questions at any time during this presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kelly Conroy.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kelly Conroy. I am a principal at Pinnacle Healthcare Consultant in the value-based care world, focusing on strategies for value-based care, ACOs and ACO reaches, and any other kind of new policy and regulations that are coming out. Pinnacle is a national healthcare consulting agency that's been in business since 1998, and we're really excited to present to you. I'm not sure who's in the audience, but typically our FLACO webinars tend to get a lot of ACOs. So I'm really excited to present Ed White and Mike Siegel to go over some of the new regulations that may make some of the innovations that you're doing in your current value-based care entities in a safe harbor and more readily available for you to make some good partnerships. So first thing I want to just talk about, just to kind of level set, I'm sure many people have seen this stair step or the spectrum, but today, obviously on the far left is where we've started, and we have been steadily moving our way up the steps to total capitation. There's many people still in shared risk. But as Mike and Ed begin to talk about what these new value-based care entity rules are, this will play a very important part, because the more risk that you take, the more of these arrangements that you can participate in. So next slide. I just wanted to show you that, from 2016, there's something called the Healthcare Land. And if you're not familiar about it, you might want to Google it, but it is the Healthcare Learning Action Network. And it's a task force that has been working endlessly for the last several years to figure out how do we take these Medicare programs and make them all payer programs, because many offices don't want to transform their entire workflow or their office just for the Medicare population. They want to do it for all of their payers. So the government came out in 2016 and said that they wanted to move as many of our fee-for-service payments to categories 3 and 4. And as you can see, from 2016 to 2020, it's gone up from 23% to 41%, is now linked into some APM built on top of fee-for-service or some population health payment like a capitated arrangement. Next slide, please, Sam. This I just threw in there. I believe this webinar and these slides will be available. I know the recording will be available after our seminar today, but I threw these statistics in there just to kind of point to a few things. On the far left, you can see that we have 199 in basic levels A and B currently. And then the next largest area is 146 ACOs in the enhanced track. So you can see we have the two largest in the lowest risk and really pushing you towards enhanced track, which is 75% of shared savings. So you can see the changes throughout the years. We now, as of 2022, have 483 Medicare shared savings ACOs for a coverage of about 11 million beneficiaries. We've saved about $2.3 billion as of 2020 as a program. A couple other little things I'll point out to you is on the far right in the middle of the screen, you can see the assignment methodology. There's prospective and there's preliminary prospective with the retroactive reconciliation. You can see that people are still choosing the retrospective methodology. So if you're someone on the phone that doesn't understand what that is, please reach out to one of us, or please look into that, because there's very good pros and cons for picking those different types of assignment methodology. And then down on the bottom left, you can see that the high revenue ACOs versus the low revenue ACOs are 44 to 56. High revenue typically is an ACO that has a health system as a part of it or a health plan as a part of it. The low revenues are typically organized as independent physicians. And then lastly, I'll just point out in all of this last decade, we now have between physician and non-physicians approximately 500,000 providers in this program. So, and as we go on, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between ACOs, DCEs, and ACO reaches, but you can see this program has gained a lot of momentum in the last decade. Next slide. And then I just wanted to wrap up. I have most notably participated in ACOs with Palm Beach ACO, Aledade, and Trinity. And I have always said from the very beginning in 2012, primary care was just trying to get a seat at the table with the health plans, really just taking whatever contracts they were given. And over the years, it was always something that we were striving for, is for primary care to really have a seat at the table. And I feel like at this point, primary care is the table. So with that being said, I want to turn it over to Mike Siegel to tell us a little bit more about what kind of arrangements we can make under these new safe harbor, value-based care safe harbors. Mike?
Thank you very much, Kelly. My name is Mike Siegel, and I am a partner in Nelson Mullins Riley in Scarborough. And along with my partner, Ed White, who you'll be hearing from shortly, we are in charge of the value-based care division of the firm. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the new ACO REACH model that was unveiled by CMS on February 24th to replace the direct contracting entity model, which is sunsetting at the end of 2022. One thing that, maybe the one thing that is very bipartisan is the idea that we are moving from fee-for-service to value-based care. That's been through 3 administrations already, but there are changes in philosophy. And the ACO REACH concept is very much focused, as we will see, on the idea of equity. And we'll talk about that, but in many ways, it's very similar to DCE. It is moving, however, beyond question back into the ACO arena. People weren't really sure whether a DCE was an ACO or not. There'll be no questions about ACO REACH. It is part of the ACO arena. They published on CMS on February 24th something called a request for applications. And those applications are very quick. In fact, they're due. If you're going to be an ACO REACH in 2023 and you're not a DCE, you have to have applied in 2 days. So anybody listening to this who is not a direct contracting model and has not applied, you're looking at the earliest 2024. But it's not too early to start looking at this stuff. And so I can tell you there's a lot of things that need to be done. And I want to talk about, even if you're part, by the way, there are 99, Kelly talked about all these different ACOs. There are currently 99 direct contracting entities, and every one of them has an opportunity, if it chooses, to attempt to transition into ACO REACH without having filed an application. But as part of that, they will be reviewed by CMS and basically audited for compliance and to make sure that they're, according to CMS, believes they're fit to move towards the equity requirements. And if you're part of an existing DCE that does intend to transition into REACH, you need to be paying immediate attention to your provider agreements, both for primary care physicians and others. Those documents are going to need significant amendments. Further, the full extent of those necessary amendments are not going to be known until the master participation agreement between ACO REACH entities and CMS is published. It is not yet published and not expected to be published until the summer. So right now, we're dealing with what is in that 116-page request for admissions, which has a lot of detail, but nowhere near all the detail the granular detail we're going to get when we see the master participation agreement. Once it's released, it's probably going to be, well, the DCE participation agreement is 290 pages. I don't expect any less with the ACO REACH, and it's very technical. It takes a lot of time to read and understand. However, you need to seriously consider, if you're a DCE and you're going to transition, locking up your providers now by preparing 2023 agreements that address what's known, what you can get out of request for amendments, and providing your REACH entity with a unilateral ability to amend the agreements once the master participation agreement is released. In other words, when we have to amend them for other information, you have a provision in the document that says that this can be amended without necessarily obtaining the consent of the participant, because it only relates to amending what's required by law. And we've been doing this for other clients, and it's a lot of work, but it's absolutely necessary in order to make sure you've got your participants lined up. Also, please, for new REACH applicants, you need to know you're not required at the time of application to include a provider list, but should be working now to tie down your providers. And for that, you also need participation agreements. So those 2023 participation agreements I'm talking about for the DCEs would also apply for you in the same theories. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. Okay. I don't know what happened to my slide. It's not on my page, but so I can't see it, but it's all right. The remainder of this presentation is going to be bullet points, and I'm going to go through them with you. First of all, the initial REACH program ends December 31, 2026. There is a implementation period where, if you want to, it's your option. If you've applied, you can be an ACO REACH starting in August of 2022. But that's only for those who have already applied and are on their way to being accepted. As with DCE, REACH has 3 categories. Standard, which is most of them, new entrants, and high needs population. For standards, you have to have at least 5,000 beneficiaries, but for new entrants ACOs, right now only 1,000, phasing up to 5,000 by the last year, and high needs 250, phasing up to 1,400 by the end of last year. As with the case of DCE REACH, you got 2 risk sharing options. The professional option, which offers 50% of shared savings or losses, and the global option, which is 100%. With global, you can choose either the professional option or a total capitation option, which includes specialty care. Unlike many ACOs, which are retrospective, and as Kelly had mentioned, this with ACO REACH, it's prospective. And not only that, the capitated payments, you get your money on a monthly basis, much earlier, for example, than when you get it with a enhanced ACO. REACH is heavily, next slide, please. I don't know if I'm getting the slide or not, because I don't have a page anymore that shows the slides. Now I do. Okay. REACH is heavily focused on the new concept of equity. So this whole idea is, for you, you're supposed to be able to show that you are serving better underserved communities. Now, what's an underserved community? I actually, HHS has a definition of underserved community, and it includes a lot of which you would normally expect. If anybody wants to see that, you can look it up. Just type in on Google underserved populations or underserved communities, and you'll get it. So the idea is, every year, starting now, if you're in this program, you have to provide and develop and implement a health equity plan using a template document that CMS is going to be distributing, and going through and answering all their questions and trying to basically measure and reduce health disparities during each performance year. In order to help, they also are focusing on, they want to get away from big companies being the primary driving forces behind this, get more back to providers. As part of that, they've changed the 25% rule in terms of who can be on the, how many providers have to be on the board, to go back to the 75% rule that we're used to with ACOs. And in addition, with the existing ACOs, you have to have a person who is a Medicare beneficiary and somebody who has a consumer advocate. It could be the same person. With this, with the ACO REACH, it's got to be two different people. You can't have one person serving a dual role. Now, they cut back on the annual performance REACH benchmark year for DCE. That's a global benchmark. I didn't say that, so just make sure you understand. That is a global benchmark, only for the global. If you're in a performance option, you don't have to do that. If you're in the global, they want, because they're given 100% risk, they want to make sure they make a little money. But as opposed to 5% from DCE, CMS has cut back the amount it takes to less, and by 3% in 23 and 24, and 3.5% after that. By the way, the triple aim is no longer quite the same triple aim you knew before with ACO REACH. It does talk about reducing, triple aim includes total health, reducing expenditures, increasing quality of care. But when you get to the third part, what the application, the request for application says, the third goal is to promote health equity, to bring the benefits of accountable care to beneficiaries in underserved communities. They're very focused on the equity. Next slide. Okay. As with DCE, the incentive payment is structured as a withhold. In other words, to meet, there's a certain amount withheld which you can get back if you meet the quality care standards and you perform well enough. However, with DCE, that withhold was pretty substantive, with 5%. With REACH, it's only 2%. In addition, they were, I don't know how many of you read the Donald Berwick articles that appeared in Health Affairs at the end of September of last year, but he talked a lot about gaming in risk coding. Well, the CMS heard about that, and they have in DCE's policies, they have with REACH's policies that restrict the growth in risk coding and are basically don't allow gaming in the same way that you allegedly could do it. They also apply an adjustment to the ACO benchmark. Again, for risk, the more underserved beneficiaries you have, the higher the adjustment you have to the benchmark to allow for the fact that these people may be sicker and will cost more to take care of. And so, next slide, please. The REACH applicants, if you're applying, again, keep focusing on equity. They not only have their standard 5 domains that were used with DCE applicants, but they've added to have a demonstrated strong track record of patient care, a demonstrated record of serving historically underserved communities with quality outcomes, and ownership structure. They want to know whether that presents any program integrity risks. Now, as you can see again, equity is all over that thing. Now, on the ownership structure, again, this is a difference between Trump and the Biden administrations. And this is in here because it's a new administration. They are focused, CMS is sensitive with the ownership of REACH ACOs by investor-backed entities. Not saying you can't have them, but then they can't be owned by investor-backed entities, but they are going to look carefully to see who's involved, to see whether there's corporate integrity in those companies. And they reserve the right, by the way, to, if you want to transition into REACH from a DCE, they have the right to say, no, you can't do it. So this is one of the things they will be looking at. Also, among the compliance that I want to mention that I didn't write in here that we've been focusing on a lot lately is the insurance risks. Every state has different rules and laws regarding what constitutes an insurance company, or whether you need to have a third-party administrator, etc. And depending upon what state your entity operates in when it's taking the kind of risk we're talking about, there may be a state law requirement that you haven't focused on. So that needs to be analyzed very closely. Finally, as you probably are aware, with DCEs, there are a lot of benefit enhancements where you have advantages, including 3-day SNF rule waivers, telehealth, care management, home visits, which you can have several a year, and post-discharge home visits. They're all carried over into ACO REACH. But in addition, they have a new nurse practitioner services benefit enhancement, which I think for Florida will work now that they've changed in 2021. They upgraded what nurse practitioners can do. And it allows nurse practitioners to undertake activities that are beyond the normal incident to requirements, including plans of care for home infusion therapy, hospice care, diabetic shoes, etc. So there's a lot of other stuff. I could give an hour talk on this, but I want to let Ed go into really the main focus of what we're talking about today. But I just want to make clear to you, this is what the availability of this opportunity. If you are availing yourself, some of the things you need to do beyond just filing an application, and you should look at it very closely in terms of whether you are intending to do it in 2024. With that, I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Ed White. Ed, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Samantha, could you go back one slide? Okay, right there. Thank you, Mike. Hello, everybody. My name is Ed White. I'm a partner with Nelson Mullins Law Firm in their Columbia, South Carolina office, and I've been practicing in healthcare regulatory matters for approximately 30 years. And I do transactional regulatory issues, and I've been looking a lot at the value-based rules that came out last year in January of 2021, they became effective. These are new Stark exceptions, and they're new anti-kickback safe harbors, and they're designed to deal with value-based care arrangements. So I want to start with this chart and just highlight some features on here, but and this is sort of a depiction. We've been working with a number of folks that are looking at ways to use these new rules. And at the centerpiece of these new regulations is this concept referred to as a value-based enterprise. And I've got that in the center of this chart, and I've got it depicted as a separate box, which may be from a structural point of view, a separate limited liability company. There's a lot of probably benefits to doing it that way. But I think, for an ACO, for those of you that are ACOs or in ACOs, you'll find as we go through this, you're overlapping very nicely with this concept of a value-based enterprise, and can probably very easily qualify to be a value-based enterprise. But the point here is, if you wanted to move it and extend what you're doing in the Medicare ACO program, this might be one format, is to extend it out as a separate entity. As we've got on this chart, the below the value-based enterprise have just a variety of ideas for participating providers, primary care specialists, also bring in MSOs or IPAs, or even the ACO network as a participant. And much like an ACO functions with providers entering into participation agreements, that would be the same concept here. In terms of and this depiction in our chart, and I'll show you just in a few minutes, but one of the ideas is that this value-based enterprise, there's a lot of flexibility. Anybody can create this. And so it may be a provider, it may be an ACO. I've got the the box at the top above the value-based enterprise. And these are all sort of clients that have talked to us about potentially forming their own value-based enterprise. And so we'll show you in a minute how to sort of evolve if you are a provider, whether it's an ACO, an ambulatory surgery center, a micro hospital, et cetera, and to standing up your own value-based enterprise. The other piece of this is that the value-based enterprise can have its own investors, and it could be, evolve into its own risk-bearing organization with its own and become its own profit center from the margins, contracting and enter into risk-based contracting, much like an ACO or an ACO or direct contracting entity, which will soon be the ACO REACH next year, does. And sort of an introductory, again, as we're going through this chart, if you envision everything down from the value-based enterprise, these are compensation relationships, and these new value-based regulations protect compensation relationships. And again, they're bringing new Stark exceptions and new anti-kickback safe harbors from the federal anti-kickback statute. The ACO, again, you may already have a lot of the functions and processes set up that could very naturally evolve or move to a value-based enterprise. But the main point for the ACOs is that these regulatory protections extend beyond just the Medicare beneficiaries that are in your program as an ACO. And ACOs historically have had a lot of flexibility with the waivers, principally for the civil monetary penalty statute and the anti-kickback statute, but there's no Stark waiver under the ACO models as they exist today. And these rules are designed to wrap around and extend beyond any programs that you may be in today, whether it's the ACO program or Innovation Center program. And so they're really, in some ways, designed to allow parties to create their own innovation center and to experiment and move forward, towards risk-based contracting. And I've got on the right side of this chart, the payers and at some point the value-based enterprise is negotiating and contracting with payers, and it can be the whole spectrum of payers: commercial, self-funded, corporate plans, ACOs, Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, MCOs, et cetera. The idea is that these regulations are designed to allow the parties to evolve and move in that direction. The main distinction I would point from the ACO program today, again, is that you've got broader Stark and anti-kickback exceptions and safe harbors. They provide more flexibility and structure and relationships with networks of providers, whether it's be physician providers or entities and facilities. And one of the key points, from the Stark perspective, there's no fair market value requirement. There's no prohibition on compensation varying with the volume or value of referrals. There's no prohibition on compensation varying with the volume and value of other business, which is generally the non-Medicare business. And you can still have just like you can under the classic Stark rules, you can still have restrictions, so that when we have these participation agreements, the parties can have restrictions that require them to refer first to other participants in this value-based enterprise, unless patient choice, if a patient chooses otherwise, or medical necessity requires, the patient could be better treated somewhere else. So you have that ability to tie the providers together. And that makes sense because you're going to be working on value-based outcomes and protocols, and to the extent you're negotiating with third parties, you want to have everybody working on the same set of protocols and programs, et cetera. The one nice thing about the Stark exception that comes with these new rules is that and again, these new rules, when you plug into the value-based enterprise through a participation agreement, and you're working towards value-based goals and et cetera, then that's when these exceptions and safe harbors will kick in. And one of the nice things is it can protect relationships between the parties. This is on the Stark side. Anti-kickback statute doesn't go that far, but if you're following value-based programs and pursuing value-based purposes, then you're probably going, and you're complying with this new Stark exception, you're probably going to be setting the stage for a very low compliance risk from the anti-kickback side as well. The one thing I don't have depicted on this chart, we have been getting a lot of questions from primary care, and I know that ACOs are primarily, the primary care foundations, is how can primary care participate in these sort of value-based arrangements. And so I've got on the left side and the bottom, the primary care could potentially be providing service directly to specialists, providing some value-based services in returns from incentives, sort of a chain relationship. On the right side, I've got the primary care in a participation agreement directly with the value-based enterprise. But in those relationships between the physicians, the Stark rules, these new exceptions can apply. And that has a lot of flexibility, particularly if, another question we've been getting a lot from folks is, we're hearing about ACOs wanting to invest or partner in joint venture with surgery centers or micro hospitals or other facilities that potentially can trigger Stark issues. And to the extent you're in these relationships, you're going to have new protections and more flexibility under the Stark law when you have physicians also referring to entities that are providing designated health services. On the right side, I didn't depict this, but we'll probably add this at some point. But we're getting a lot of questions about, well, can primary care contract with specialists and bring specialists into initiatives through the primary care group? There's possibilities to do that. And again, you anytime you've got those referral relationships, you'll have new ways to protect those to the extent they're working towards these value-based initiatives. I think, Samantha, if you'll move to the next slide. And again, just a reminder, Kelly's slide on the staircase towards, risk-based contracting. Clearly, the ACO programs have been moving providers towards this with the MSSP and the enhanced model. The direct contracting entity, which is soon to be the ACO REACH, is designed to take it, several more steps up the staircase towards full capitation and risk-based contracting. And so these rules, and we'll walk through some of the details, they're designed to allow to not only wrap around your current protections in the ACO program, but they're also allowed to extend beyond that as you pursue beneficiaries that are outside of the lives that are attributed to the ACO, and also as you go into the commercial programs or directly with employer plans. Next slide, please. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but this is what we refer to as an evolutionary slide of a value-based enterprise. And we're talking to a lot of providers that are interested in this. It may be some type of facility, ambulatory surgery center, or radiation therapy center, or it could be a hospital, micro hospital. Anybody that wants to take the initiative to set up the value-based enterprise and start working with, and I've got, for simplicity, just one group, but you could have, from our first chart, any number of providers plugging into the value-based enterprise. And this will go through the different phases, but the ultimate, for now, the ultimate goal is for the value-based enterprise to evolve into a risk-bearing organization and be negotiating and contracting with payers across the spectrum. And you have these enhanced protections. And at that place, the value-based enterprise as a risk-bearing organization has the potential to make its own margins and it may have additional investors and bring in its own returns. Next slide, please. So again, the regulations themselves, we'll take a little bit of a walk through these rules. They were effective January 2021. There's new Stark exceptions and there's new anti-kickback safe harbors. And again, these only apply to compensation relationships, and any ownership interests have to be analyzed under the classic Stark and the classic anti-kickback statutes. Next slide. As I was depicting in that first chart, the value-based enterprise is the hub that's designed to plug providers into the protections afforded by these new rules. These rules, in a lot of ways, there's no definition on what you do. In fact, CMS went so far to say that they did not want to prescribe protected activities for fear that it would limit, that people would feel they're limited to what CMS was describing. It's wide open for you to experiment and customize protocols and processes and work towards value-based initiatives in ways that you really haven't been allowed to do before under the Stark law and the anti-kickback statute. So we like to refer to the value-based enterprise as your own innovation center, much like CMS has its innovation center. And if you're entrepreneurial, then you may evolve to it becoming a risk-bearing organization and its own profit center. Next slide. Now, I've taken the liberty of sort of categorize these rules under 3 models. This nomenclature is not exactly the way it's articulated in the regulations, but it's important to note this is the first time that CMS on the Stark side and the OIG on the anti-kickback statute side got together and coordinated their efforts to write regulations and try to bring as much parity to their rules to allow providers to move down these pathways. And so they each have 3 different models. I call them models. They're really exceptions or safe harbors, but they really are where you can go in and structure arrangements like I was showing you in the first chart. And the first one I refer to as a care coordination model. And that's really designed to do exactly what the label says, is to align providers for care coordination and bring them together under a common system, platform, technology, protocols, processes, et cetera. The second model is a partial risk model, and the third model is the full risk model. And next slide, please. Now, the concept of the value-based enterprise that we depicted in the first chart, it can be as simple as 2 or more participants in contracts. So it's designed, if you just had 2 providers, a physician and a hospital, or a physician and another entity, you could have the mechanics of it in a contract. It can also be a separate legal entity. And that's where we've been talking about, potentially it becoming a standalone risk-bearing organization, becomes some profit center. But it's got to be working on at least one value-based purpose. And it has to have an accountable body, with oversight for the financial and operational aspects of the value-based enterprise. And the governing documents have to describe how the value-based purposes and how the value-based participants intend to achieve those purposes. So for those of you that are in ACOs or operating ACOs, this probably sounds very similar to what you're doing today for your ACO program. And this would just require you to retool or set up an affiliate that have very much the same processes and very much the same resources you use today. Next slide, please. The value-based arrangement, and we're going through definitions, because one thing to note is these rules are very definitionally oriented. So when you're working to comply with them, we often hear, particularly in the ACO space, folks say, well, gosh, aren't we already in a value-based enterprise? And the answer is you're probably very close and probably can very rarely qualify, but you have to go through these definitional aspects. You have to document it in governing instruments, and you have to be very careful that you put in the processes and procedures that are technically required for the value-based enterprise. One of them is this value-based arrangement, and that's basically the compensation relationships with the providers that will be in sort of the classic participation agreements that ACOs use today, something very similar. The participants for STARK can only be physicians and entities that provide designated health services. Those are only two parties that can trip those rules and get into trouble there. For the anti-kickback statute, the list of participants is much broader, and it's designed to encompass the parties who need the protections. And the value-based activities between the participants and can be protected with different degrees under STARK and anti-kickback, but that's an important feature, is those relationships between the parties can be protected. The next slide, please. The value-based activity, it's a provision of an item or service or the taking of an action. Significantly for STARK, a referral, if it's in the care coordination model, if you're making the referral, for coordinating the care, getting the patient to the right place, that activity itself can be protected under STARK. Anti-kickback statute, the safe harbors don't go that far, but that is a significant feature. And the other aspect of it is the value-based activities. The value-based enterprise has to monitor and at least annually assess whether or not the protocols and the processes that the value-based enterprise has put in place are achieving their purposes. And there's a very, very good reason for that, is you're getting new exceptions under STARK, and you're getting new safe harbors under anti-kickback statute, and you're given the opportunity to innovate and create your own processes, your own protocols, and your own activities to try to reach the goals. And so they want to know that you're making progress if you're going to have the shelter from these laws that are principally aimed at problematic referrals, where there's overutilization or remuneration for referrals. So you have to at least annually monitor your activities. Are they making progress towards your goals? If not, within a time period, 60 days, you have to modify or terminate that protocol or that process. And you still have the benefit of the protections up to that point in time. So these are very generous, flexible rules. Next page, please. The value-based purposes, they're much like what you're familiar with if you're in the ACO program today. There's basically 4 purposes, and you have to be your activities have to be aimed at accomplishing at least one of these. Care coordination, increasing quality, reducing cost or the growth in costs. And the 4th one is transitioning from fee-for-service to value-based payment mechanisms. And it's basically, helping the parties get ready, the providers, equip them and enable them to start functioning in risk-based contracting. The purpose of including this transitioning from fee-for-service mechanisms to value-based payment arrangements opens the door for the value-based enterprise to basically subsidize the cost to stand up the value-based enterprise, the infrastructure, the software, the legal, the consulting expenses to bring the providers together. And as you'll see in these rules, it can disproportionately, much like the ACO waivers, the formation phase of the ACO can disproportionately subsidize some of those costs. You can do that here, and you can do it outside of the ACO program under these new rules. Next slide, please. I mentioned this previously, the value-based participant for STARK, it's just physicians and designated health service entities. For anti-kickback statute, it's much broader, but you do have these exceptions in the footnote, and I won't go through them all, but laboratory companies are excluded, pharmaceutical manufacturers, compounding pharmacies, DME companies. These are folks that it's still problematic. They're not going to give these full protections to them, but it's still a very, very powerful tool to have STARK exceptions and anti-kickback statute safe harbors that work in tandem and reduce risk. And that's an important takeaway point. These new rules can reduce compliance risk. And if you're migrating towards partial risk and risk-based contracting, the government has basically said that the protections from being in risk-based contracting from overutilization or parties wanting to provide remuneration for referrals, the things the government, these two regulatory regimes are aimed at, that those natural controls in a risk-based environment are much stronger than anything the government can regulate. So they view risk-based contracting as a substitute for the protections that the government is trying to impose with these regulations today. So it's an important piece when you talk about reducing compliance risk. Next page. Target patient population. Again, we're working through definitions that are lining you up to be a value-based enterprise and allowing you to step into these new exceptions and safe harbors. The target-based population, unlike the ACO program, you get to define it completely. And you need to do so in advance in writing, but you have complete flexibility to set it how broadly or narrow your target patient population is. And there's no minimum number of attributed lives. So when you're stepping into these rules, it's not like you have to meet certain thresholds of assigned beneficiaries to start functioning in these rules. Next slide, please. Let's walk through the models for a moment. The first one's a care coordination model. That's the simplest to implement. This is really to bring the providers together. There's no risk that has to be assumed in this model. And this really allows the parties to learn how to function together in value-based arrangements and migrate towards partial risk and full risk models. Again, you have to monitor and modify activities that are not achieving one of the value-based purposes. But importantly here, Stark does not have a fair market value requirement. There's no volume of value prohibition on compensation varying with the volume of value of referrals. And there's no prohibition on compensation varying with the volume and value of other business, which is a part of exceptions under Stark as they exist today. So if you're in an ACO and you're functioning strictly in the Medicare program, you don't have any additional Stark rules. And it may be fine to network and affiliate providers under the waivers you have in the ACO rules. But if you want more flexibility and expanding beyond that and ways that the providers can be compensated, and again, particularly, we're hearing more and more about ACOs wanting to invest or partner with their own facilities, and some of those, if a micro hospital or the surgery centers are not going to be designated health services, but imaging centers and any other modalities that you may directly put into your program or ownership to have your physicians use. You have new ways to compensate them that you don't if you're just in the classic ACO program, because you have new exceptions under Stark. Okay, next slide, please. When you're in the care coordination model, the anti-kickback safe harbor only protects in-kind remuneration, doesn't protect cash compensation to providers. And when you have, but this allows you to disproportionately subsidize providers that are joining into the value-based enterprise through participation agreements, whether it's help with technology, software, the legal expenses of standing it up, case management, workers, whatever. But they've got to pay at least 15% of any costs that they're being subsidized or any in-kind contributions. There is, under the anti-kickback statute safe harbors, it's not in the value-based regulations, but it is a new amendment to an existing safe harbor, a provision in the management contracts and outcome-based payment safe harbor. It's been modified. It includes outcome-based payments that can protect cash payments in a care coordination model. This one isn't as liberal as the other value-based rules. For the anti-kickback statute safe harbor here in care coordination, there's no fair market value requirement. But if you're going to pay cash compensation, you can step into this other safe harbor. It has to be at fair market value for anti-kickback purposes. It has to be based on some outcome measures of compensation that they're working towards achieving, and it has to have at least quality and cost. It can't just be one or the other. But the takeaway point here is when we talk about there's not a fair market value requirement, I mean, we're still hearing, you think about the liability exposure that fair market value, it's a feature of both the anti-kickback statute, the analysis there, whether or not there's remuneration being paid for referrals somewhere else, and Stark, virtually all the Stark exceptions have a fair market value requirement. So when recognizing the care coordination model, you've got this nuance where if you're going to pay cash compensation, you step into a classic fair market value rule. But these other, the care coordination exception is the safe harbor itself for any kickback, where you can subsidize 85% of in-kind contributions or the Stark. No fair market value. It's not so much that you can say, okay, now I can pay more than fair market value. The real point here is you're removing substantial compliance risk. And everybody we talk to, they still say, this is all still about funds flow. Is everybody getting the right returns for their investments, their efforts, their work? And if they're not, there's no reason to really come in here. So we're not advocating you use a no fair market value requirement to go out and pay people excessively. But what you're really doing is you're removing compliance risk and you're removing the burdens of having to demonstrate that. The Toomey case, the Halifax case, and others all turned on, valuations that could not support fair market value, or this other piece under Stark, varying with compensation, varying with the volume of value referrals. So just understand as we go through this, these safe harbors are reducing compliance exposures. Next page, please. The partial risk model, this is sort of moving up that staircase that Kelly described. And you're moving into programs where you've got some partial risk being assumed. For Stark, it must be at least 10% the physicians at risk for the comp. This could be done through withholds, repayment requirements, incentive and tied to outcomes, et cetera. Next page. And in the partial risk model for the anti-kickback statute, the value-based enterprise must assume at least substantial downside financial risk. There's 3 different methodologies for that. There's basically, the value-based enterprise itself is 30% risk of any against a benchmark for any losses that could be occurred, or it's a 20% downside risk for any episodes, payments through episodes of care, or it's in a partial capitated model where there's some cost-saving capitated payment that is designed to pay for on some periodic basis per patient per month. And the value-based enterprise has to meet these thresholds to meet safe harbor. Next page. But the individual participants, the providers, they only have to have a meaningful share of downside risk, which is 2-sided risk of the losses and savings. And just a reminder, the anti-kickback statute doesn't protect, the safe harbor doesn't protect relationships between the participants in the value-based enterprise. Stark will. Next slide. The full financial risk model is basically what it says. You have full financial risk on some prospective basis for all items and services covered by the payer. There is a 12-month transitional rule to allow the parties to get functioning on in the new arrangement. And this can be done by capitated payments. It can be done through shared savings and other incentives. Next page. The value-based enterprise is also permitted to mitigate risk through stop loss protection, risk corridors, et cetera. You can't shift significant risk back to the payer. That's one aspect there. If you would, next page. And again, just to summarize, a notable distinction, these new regulations from the classic rules, the cost to stand up the value-based enterprise and create the infrastructure can be disproportionately funded. As of January 1 of 2022, profit distributions, including profits from designated health services, can be paid to physicians in a group practice through a value-based enterprise without a minimum number of physicians. This is much more liberal than just a classic start, but it's more than what you have under an ACO. So if you're bringing in modalities that have designated health services and you want to incentivize physicians and you've got these new Stark rules, you can much more liberally, pay. And the idea is if you're entering into, these partial risk and risk, you've got more protections. And so the government doesn't really, is not so much concerned about you paying profits from designated health services and paying them just to portions of a group, rather than the classic rules say you can't pay to subgroups less than 5. The no fair market value requirement, Stark or anti-kickback. The exception is that anti-kickback, care coordination, safe harbor. If you're going to pay cash compensation, you got to use that other safe harbor, which has the fair market value. Next page, please. No prohibition on payments varying with the volume of value referrals. This includes the designated health services, which are covered by Stark, as well as other business. These rules can wrap around and expand existing protections and existing programs. The ACO programs, Innovation Center programs, Medicare Advantage, or even the classic Stark and anti-kickback statute arrangements. They can protect relationships, other business generated, might trip, problems with Stark under the commercial arrangements. Last page, please. Next page. I think that's my last page. Quick note for 501c3 hospitals, we hear this question, well, gosh, we can't participate in these rules because we still have fair market value requirements under the private enrollment, private benefit. It goes back to, you can still pay everybody fair market value. Now, fair market value is sort of on this continuum, and it's going to be shifting as you back up, please, Samantha, prior page. But as you move, private benefit, private enrollment, but as you move towards risk-based contracting, in theory, maybe payments ought to be increasing to some degree, if to the extent parties are assuming risk. But you pay fair market value, you're reducing compliance risk from Stark and anti-kickback. And just a reminder, the referral restriction, the parties to a value-based enterprise can be required to refer to other participants in the value-based enterprise. I think I'm out of time, but if we need to, do we have questions? If we need to, we can go back to that one slide, but if not, let's go to questions.
I do have one question that has come in. I would like to clarify your statements as to provider participation in shared savings distribution models based in part of adherence to ACO in-network referral targets. Does this relaxed rule waiver apply to an ACO currently participating in NextGen and other commercial ACOs, shared saving arrangements, whether upside down only or upside downside?
I'm not sure I followed that question completely.
I'll read the second part again. They're asking, does the relaxed rule waiver apply to an ACO currently participating in NextGen or other commercial ACO shared savings arrangements, whether they are upside only or upside downside?
Either way.
Yeah, these rules are extensions of whatever waivers and protections you have in these programs. These rules can wrap around and extend beyond that. And so the notable point there is, to the extent you're functioning in whatever generation of ACO and you're functioning under your current waivers and rules, what you can really do differently is, because the anti-kickback waiver under the ACO waivers, and I think there's something similar in the DCEs, basically says if you comply with Stark, you get the waiver of anti-kickback, and that's sort of the classic Stark. Now we have a new Stark exception, but we also have new anti-kickback exceptions. So you layer these on top, and it will define how you can pay providers and how you can align providers, in these network arrangements.
Okay. One other question. What do you think is the future of the MSSP ACO program?
Mike or Kelly, I want to.
Yeah, I'll answer that. I will tell you that I think they'll continue to be revised and continue to move more towards risk, but I don't think they're going away anywhere in the near future. Have seen no indication of that. You know, we did have a little bit of a political battle over direct contracting entity, which is now morphed into, or will morph into, ACO REACH, but it's just a different model of the same concept. So I think ACOs will continue. You know, in reality, you've got Medicare Advantage, which is a separate program and is a not insignificant part of the entire Medicare industry, and seems to be moving more and more in that direction. But as long as you have a significant amount of the population in Medicare, I think you're going to continue to have the ACO program.
I would agree. I think we're always going to have fee for service. We're always going to have MA, and the ACO's been around for 10 years, and they've just moved, like you said, the DCE into more like an ACO model. So I don't think we're going to see them go away. Just we're going to see some adjustments. All right. Well, I think that time, right, Sam?
Yes, it is. And I'd like.
Sam, I just want to mention, I just want to say that I think that all of the panelists will be available. If you want to send questions privately, I think you'll have our email addresses, and we'll be happy to try to answer them.
Yes, and thank you, Ed, Mike, and Kelly, for taking the time to present this information to us today. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. I will be sending out an email with contact information of our panelists. So if you do have any follow-up questions, please reach out. We'll also provide a link to the webinar recording and the PowerPoint presentation. So please feel free to share this link with anyone you may think may be interested, and watch for more webinars coming up. We'd also like to formally announce that our fall conference will be taking place in Orlando, October 17th and 19th, and we'll hope you join us there. We hope you all have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.